So I am also English education major. Megan and I are the only two this semester. We are also the last two who even have to go through this entire program. So yay, we're at the end, we're almost done. My presentation is even a little bit different from Megan's. Mine is about 2 reading strategies that promote reading proficiency by having students actively mark up a piece of paper. So the first school I was placed at during my student teaching experience was a middle school that puts heavy emphasis on college readiness. The school houses a magnet program for arts integration, and the administration stresses the importance of incorporating skills from each discipline into every class. This is where I first heard of marking the text and writing in the margins. The administration was actually in the process of encouraging all the disciplines to utilize these reading strategies in their classrooms. So before I can tell you about the strategies, I need to explain a bit about their origin. Marking the text and writing in the margins are AVID annotation strategies. AVID, which stands for Advancement via Individual Determination, is an organization that helps schools shift toward a more student-centered approach to teaching. Enrollment in the program gives teachers materials and strategies to give students the tools they need to succeed in college and in any future careers. So these 2 strategies, called marking the text and writing in the margins, are basic annotation strategies meant to help students increase their reading proficiency by having them literally put their pencils to paper. The following strategies are incredibly adaptable to any discipline, and it is not uncommon to find that most proficient readers already use them, even if they don't realize that they do. The first strategy, marking the text, helps students parse through information initially presented in any given text. There are 3 markings specific to marking the text. Numbering, in which the student numbers each paragraph or stanza when working with poetry. Circling, in which the student circles key terms, authors, numbers, character names, places, or descriptive words. And underlining, in which students underline claims or arguments, figurative language, and specific descriptions. So this is a student example of marking the text that I did with my 8th graders. It is kind of a lot to look at. They read the rationale and goal statements for several ad council PSA campaigns in order to familiarize themselves with the format for when they had to write their own. In this exercise, students circled any numbers and key terms and underlined possible goals of the campaign. This student even took her markings a step further by marking the campaign's target audience. After discussing the marks as a class, the students identified the campaign's goals, which are written on the bottom of the image, and possible counterclaims, which are written at the top. Once students have marked their texts, they can begin writing in their margins. There are 6 components to writing in the margins. The first is visualization, where students literally draw images in their margins to make sense of what they've read. The second is summarization, which is kind of fairly self-explanatory. Students summarize what they've read in each section. The third is clarification, where students ask themselves what they can and need to do in order to better understand the text. The fourth is connecting, wherein students make connections within the text to other texts and to their own lives in the real world. The fifth is response, where students mark their initial responses to a text. Do they agree or disagree with the author's claim? Did something about the text elicit an emotional response? And is anything particularly interesting? And last but not least is questioning, where students ask critical questions to aid in their comprehension. Questions about the nature of the author's meaning, what the student understands, and whether the student agrees or disagrees with the author's stance are all to be expected. When determining how best to utilize writing in the margins in a language arts class, it is important to remember that a strategy that works for one student probably will not work for every student. Because of this, students should always have the option to choose which writing in the margin strategy they use. These strategies can be used independently or in conjunction with each other, and having students use 2 or 3 of these strategies often leads to even deeper levels of understanding. It also prevents students from simply summarizing and calling it a day, which they do try to do. So the following image is an example of 2 writing in the margin strategies being used to initiate analysis of William Blake's poem, The Tiger. Upon first reading, the marker responded to things she saw in the text. The image of the tiger in the forest are fearsome and mysterious. She found the image beautiful and fearsome. She writes half-formed questions of the nature of the star's spheres and the image of the lamb. During a second reading, the marker began to question. Will the speaker's initial question be answered? Are the wings an allusion to Icarus? Why does the tempo and meter of stanza 5 change, and what does that change mean? The first stanza is repeated in stanza 6, except for the changing of could to dare. What could be the reason for the change? These observations and questions would then lead to an in-depth analysis of Blake's use of metaphor and figurative language to describe the fearsome and unnamed experience the speaker faces. So just like my middle school wanted, these 2 strategies are highly adaptable and easily tailored to suit the needs of any discipline. Even in STEM, there is room for reading comprehension. These strategies can easily be incorporated by using them to help students keep track of the steps of a word problem or a complicated equation, or to help keep track of complex cycles and processes in science. Even the nature of the strategy's format is adjustable. Many students, teachers, and schools do not have access to books that students can write in, and it can be cumbersome to make hundreds of photocopies of an excerpt from a textbook or a novel. This can easily be worked around through the use of sticky notes, which students can write on places they see fit and then later remove when they're no longer needed. Another option, like I sort of mentioned earlier, is the use of technology, providing students an electronic copies of a text. If made available via some sort of file sharing application, like a PowerPoint or a document shared to a Google Classroom, students can save any file as a PDF directly to their devices to mark digitally. While working with digital copies, students can even save and mark the text multiple times should they or the teacher wish. This is what we did with the first marking example that I put up there. So in the end, why does it matter? Why do we need to be teaching these strategies, and why do students need to understand how to utilize them? Simply, students don't know how to annotate, a fact that can be clearly observed by the oceans of highlighted yellow text in college textbooks. Even proficient readers sometimes struggle with finding the most important ideas in a text, and it is not uncommon for students to read just to prove that they have some basic understanding of the material. Such reading does not allow for deep and meaningful analysis of a text. These strategies force students to slow down as they read. In an article for the National Council of Teachers of English and the English Journal, high school teacher Carol Porter O'Donnell states that, quote, reading is a process and that applying the ways of responding to text through annotation changes comprehension. Because annotating slows the reading down, students discover and uncover ideas that would not have emerged otherwise, unquote. These strategies also make students active readers and makes them aware of their own thinking process while forcing them to consider ideas in a way that they would not have ever considered before. These reading strategies help create habits that turn into a lifelong ability to read and analyze texts at a level much deeper than cursory understanding and push students to be proficient readers by putting pencil to paper. Any student is capable of being a proficient reader, and these tools will only make it easier. Thank you.
Okay, so Michaela, I have a question for you.
Yes.
Certainly we get to various schools. All schools have their own personalities. They have their own tool sets. We get into one school and we find a very specific process writing program that we are expected to follow. We get into another school, they're focusing a lot on annotation. And so my question is this: I have an 8th grader. They're reading Night in the Diesel. And her instructions were to use 6 different colors of sticky notes to annotate 6 different elements of literature. Plot, setting, tone, theme, symbolism, these kinds of things. Okay, so at the end of 4 pages, it took her like an hour and a half. She really grooved on it. She was having a blast with it. And so I looked at her book, and there were at least 100 sticky notes sticking out of 4 pages. So that's got to be too much. Where do we figure out what the balance is for the programs that our schools are using?
So with these specific reading strategies, it's a matter of coming at the text with a specific purpose in mind. So in the instance of looking the specific parts of literature, was what it was, I would say the teacher should probably have had the students pick a few, maybe 2 or 3 that they should be looking for and marking them that way instead of looking for 6. Like for these 6 specific parts of writing in the margins, you wouldn't have a student try to do all 6 at once because that would just be a mess. So like there's only so much that students can really be expected to do and do it well. Dr. Wenger?
I had a question. I was wondering if you could make the leap then from reading to writing. So I teach annotation in my first year classes because it's often underappreciated, and we have to understand what we're reading so we can write about it well. So one of the reasons why I do it is to teach reading rhetorically, so reading as a writer as opposed to reading as a reader. And you were mentioning a lot of points about reading as a reader and really understanding the content. Do you ever try to make a leap to reading as a writer then, or how do you see, in other words, these practices then moving forward into, okay, now we're going to start writing about this text, and how can those annotations help you to begin to think about that process?
I think using these specific annotation strategies makes it easier for students to compile their thoughts, because a lot of these strategies have to do with students' individual reactions to the text and connections that they personally make. And I think even teaching reading as a writer needs to start here, because if students can't adequately figure out their own thoughts, then how can they be expected to write them? Charlie?
For the writing in the margins, did you find that you went through or kind of reviewing these particular assignments that there was sort of a prevalence of a certain type that you're seeing more than others, or was it pretty balanced and spread out?
It really varies by student and by class. In my middle school, I would have seen a lot more like the visualization and the drawing images. It was a very creative group of kids. Whereas maybe in the high school that I'm at now, I would probably see more of the summarization, some of the initial reactions. I think the age of the student also kind of plays a factor too, but it is a very personal technique that can vary so widely from student to student and even from day to day that I think it would be kind of hard to pin down. Olivia?
So I know that you've spent spend like several weeks with these kids, so maybe it's not enough time to like accurately gauge like you know, plot improvements over the course of a year. But did you see like marked improvements like in student writing or comprehension of the text, like when you were working with them and like applying these concepts?
Specifically for the marking the text, for that specific assignment, we did it 3 different times. And each time we did it, I noticed that the students did find it easier and easier to pick out the specific parts of the statements that they needed to pick out. From hearing my cooperating teachers talk about it, they have seen considered improvement from the beginning of the year to when I showed up in the end of January. But I really wasn't with them long enough to see any kind of like extended improvement. 7 weeks isn't really a long time, unfortunately.
Is there also, in terms of stages of reading and rereading, different ways of using marks? I know you had blue and black reading in one of them. And sometimes you know, I like to use pencil when I first read it, I want to get, so I can erase the marks and then go back. And then the rereading is so important. That's because the annotation, what helps me the most is with the rereading. I noticed that with the lake poem.
So, again, a lot of it is student preference. One of the reasons I use that specific example of a lake poem is because you could see the clear distinction between the two different markings, especially because they are very similar markings. Again, because it is such a personal strategy, it really varies from student to student.
But there was stages of, you know, pre-reading and reading and rereading. Not sure.
It's encouraged that students read and mark and then reread for like the second set of marks if they use 2 or 3. Students don't always follow that because they kind of like to do their own thing sometimes. But especially in close reading, it is always encouraged that students do read the text multiple times.
Okay, great, thank you.